That afternoon, the sky over Georgia wore a heavy ash-gray veil, as if even the sun was too tired to shine down on a land that had endured too much pain. A breeze drifted through the worn rooftops, carrying the faint scent of gasoline from the small garage at the end of the street where Elias Granger stood with his head bowed, hands stained with motor oil, and eyes hollow, like a man still trapped on some distant battlefield. 3 years had passed. 3 years since Elias was airlifted out of the blast zone in Kandahar. And 3 years since they told him that Shadow the K-9, trained from puppyhood to serve by his side, hadn't survived. They said no body was found. They said the explosion was too powerful. They said it was best to leave everything buried out there. But Elias never did. Every night, after the garage lights went dark and the small wooden house at the end of the road fell into silence, Elias kept one ritual alive. He placed a wooden photo frame beside his pillow. Inside was a weathered picture, its edges faded by night fog. In it, Elias stood in uniform, his arm around Shadow the proud German shepherd in a ballistic vest, ears alert, head high, and eyes that stared ahead with a courage that no fire could bend. He wasn't a dog, Elias once said to a friend. He was the only teammate who ever ran into flames just to pull me out. No hesitation, no questions. In Elias's world, some things simply couldn't be replaced. And Shadow was one of them. By the window, the gray shag rug remained untouched where Shadow used to curl up after patrol. The stainless steel water bowl still sat beside it, though it had long been dry and silent. And hanging quietly from the coat hook on the wall, a black collar with faded engraving. Shadow, K9, 42B. Elias had never taken it down. He never brought home another dog. Someone once asked why. Elias simply said, "Because he's still here." That afternoon, as the skies darkened with rain, Elias sat alone on the old wooden chair out on the porch. The rain hadn't come yet, but the air had turned damp and cold. From his shirt pocket, he pulled out a weathered keychain with a brass name tag. It was once attached to Shadow's armor, the only thing recovered from the explosion. Elias turned it slowly in his fingers, then pressed it against his chest, a silent habit no one was around to see anymore. He didn't cry. The old soldier had endured more loss than most could ever fathom. But in his eyes was something sharper than tears, a quiet emptiness, deep and unmoving. In Elias's mind, Shadow's bark still echoed through the nights, sometimes a warning growl, sometimes the excited howl when the kennel door creaked open. And some nights, Elias would jolt awake, heart racing from a dream of a leap, a lick to the hand, one more look into those soulful eyes. But every morning the house stayed as quiet as before. And Shadow's resting place remained empty. Elias had no idea that just a few blocks away, behind the rust-stained bars of a kennel at the Jefferson County Rescue Shelter, another soul was lying still beneath the soft tapping of rain on the corrugated roof. A creature marked by a long scar down its ribs, and a memory that never stopped aching. Shadow was curled tightly, his body pressed into the coldest corner of the cage. His eyes weren't fully shut, nor wide open. They hovered somewhere in between, just enough to track every dim movement beyond the mesh. Not because he was afraid, but because sleep had never felt safe. The breeze slipped through a crack in the door, bringing with it the scent of damp earth and old metal. Shadow sniffed once, gently lifting his head. It wasn't food. It wasn't a stranger. It was something older than either of those, like ash buried in memory, like the faint, bitter scent of spent gunpowder clinging to the past. Beneath his belly lay a thin layer of cloth, once part of an old bed sheet. The staff called it his new bed. But nothing felt new to Shadow when his mind was still chained to somewhere else. The first night he arrived, Shadow barked, not to scare anyone, but to call out. No one understood. They shook their heads and scribbled in their reports. They labeled him unpredictable, wrote down the words PTSD, high risk, unsuitable for contact. No one noticed how he panted in his sleep, his legs twitching with memories of running. No one saw the flicker in his eyes every time a man's footsteps echoed down the hall. There was no panic in that look, no joy either, only waiting. Because deep in Shadow's memory lived the face of a man who once held him close after every firefight, a man who pressed his hand gently to the top of his head and whispered, "Good job, old boy." A man who once stood in a desert, thunderous with gunfire, and said, "If I die, I want to die beside you." Then came the explosion. Then blood. Then chaos, the blur of lights, the metallic clang of shattered gear, the roar of helicopters overhead, the sting of burning powder still hanging in the air. And then, nothing. Shadow couldn't remember how he made it out. He didn't know who pulled him from the rubble. What he did remember was the silence. No more Elias, no more steady hand, no more voice calling his name, Shadow 42B, like a promise wrapped around survival. From that moment on, it was just a blur of cages and strange faces. Sometimes they tied him up. Sometimes they shoved him into overcrowded pens where the hunger was louder than the barking. Sometimes people reached out to touch him. Shadow growled. Not out of violence. But because if it wasn't Elias, he didn't want to be touched again. This rainy afternoon, Shadow made no sound. He didn't bark. He just lay still. But his ears lifted. His eyes opened a little wider. Somewhere, far off, a sound broke through the hush. It was familiar, faint but unmistakable. The rumble of an old engine straining against the rain. A sound he remembered from the days riding back to base beside Elias. The slow crunch of tires on wet gravel. The squeak of a car door opening. Footsteps. And a rhythm that his memory still knew by heart. A familiar shape, large yet frail, was curled up in the corner of the kennel. The ears were pinned back, the body still. But the moment those footsteps echoed down the hall, the figure sprang up like a coiled spring finally released. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time forgot how to move. Elias stepped back half a pace, his lips parted, but no words came out. Shadow. Shadow's forelegs froze mid-step on the cold concrete floor. He didn't bark, didn't run. He just stood there, staring at the face in front of him, the face once smeared in blood and desert dust, the face Shadow had believed was lost forever on foreign ground. Elias stepped closer. Slowly. His hand trembled as he reached for the kennel door. "Is that Shadow?" No command, no call, no cue. But Shadow moved forward. No hesitation. No growl. Just a quiet press of his muzzle into the center of Elias's open palm. A sound escaped. Not loud. Just the gentlest hush, like wind slipping through leaves. But it was enough. Elias knew that sound, a shallow breath. Shaken. His knees gave way. He sank to the floor, his hands meeting the ground. "Old boy, is it really you?" A tail brushed against his hand, then swayed again, soft and slow. And for the first time in 3 years, Elias wept. Not the cry of a soldier, but the cry of a man who had lost the most precious part of his soul, only to find it returned. Shadow had rarely barked, not since arriving at the Jefferson shelter. Every day passed in silence, filled only with the sigh of wind between the bars and the steady march of military boots pacing by. But that day, Shadow barked. Not without reason, just one bark. Low, hoarse, like the echo of a bell rung long ago in a place scorched by sun and heavy with the scent of gunpowder. Elias was setting a donation bag on the front counter when his whole body tensed. He didn't even think. He just turned instinctively, eyes locked on the hallway behind the reception desk. It was just one bark. But Elias knew that sound like he knew his own heartbeat. He had heard it in the freezing nights of Kandahar when Shadow caught the scent of buried mines, when Shadow warned of strangers, when Shadow charged through smoke and fire straight toward him. Elias didn't say a word. He just moved. No one had to guide him. He didn't ask for directions. He walked like someone who had already left pieces of his soul in that place. The hallway to the kennels was dim, the flicker of weak fluorescent lights painting the floor in patches. The air was thick with the sharp bite of disinfectant and the musky weight of wet dogs. Most people would wrinkle their nose. Elias felt nothing but the pounding in his chest. He stopped at the third kennel from the end. Everything went still. Inside sat a creature, large, thin, one ear folded down, back slightly hunched from an old injury, and the eyes, those eyes. Elias stepped closer. His hand reached for the bars. Shadow? No movement. Elias drew in a slow breath. His voice dropped, gentler now. It's me. No growl. None of the defensive reactions the staff had warned about. Just a slow, deliberate shift. Shadow lifted his head, tilted it, then moved closer to the front of the cage. His eyes weren't as clear as before. There was a cloudiness now, maybe from the meds or the weeks of hunger and exhaustion. But buried deep behind that mist was the gaze Elias remembered. The same look that once held him steady in the middle of a war zone. Elias slipped his hand through the bars, the hand that once gripped a rifle, the hand that used to thump against armored chest plates when calling out, "Good job, Shadow." That same hand now trembled. Shadow pressed his nose against it. Slowly, gently. A sound rose up, not quite a bark, more like a soft whimper, like air escaping from a place it had been trapped too long. Elias sank to his knees. For the first time in 3 years, the name Shadow was spoken aloud with a real voice, not in dreams, not through old recordings of training sessions played over and over in the dead of night. And in that exact moment, the tail moved. Not fast, not strong, just one slow wag. But it was enough to close every distance between them. A staff member came rushing over, voice tight with alarm. "Sir, please, don't get close to him. He's aggressive." But Elias never took his eyes off Shadow. He spoke only one sentence. "Number this is Shadow. And Shadow isn't aggressive. He's just been waiting for me to come back." The woman opened her mouth to say something more, but the words caught in her throat. She saw the way Shadow leaned his head against the bars, saw the look in those eyes. And in that moment, there was nothing left to deny. This wasn't a random reunion. This was a return. A memory once buried deep, now rising summoned back by a single bark. On the way home, the rain began to fade. Sunlight peeked through the canopy, scattering across the windshield like old memories flickering back to life. The old pickup jolted over potholes, but Shadow didn't move. He sat calmly in the passenger seat. No leash, no collar, no command, just that same spot right beside Elias, as if those 3 years apart had never happened. Elias glanced over. There was a small new scar along Shadow's flank. The fur was uneven there, the skin a little darker. Elias didn't ask. He just reached out, placed a hand on Shadow's head, gave one slow rub, and whispered, "Let's go home." The wooden gate creaked open. The little house hadn't changed. Leaves still blanketed the porch. The tomato vines had dried. The old stainless steel bowl still sat by the back steps, now covered in a thin layer of dust. Shadow stepped down from the truck, not in a rush. His paws met the ground, then paused. He lifted his head and looked around at every corner, every crooked gardening fork still stuck in the soil, every uneven stepping stone he had once slipped on as a pup. Elias opened the door. Shadow walked in. No hesitation. No fear. Just slow steps, like retracing the map of his own memory. To the right was the kitchen, where Elias used to pour breakfast kibble each morning. To the left, the sun-bleached wooden couch where Shadow once laid his chin while Elias watched the news. Deeper inside, by the fireplace, sat the same gray rug, still a bit frayed, still marked with the faint scratch of old nails. Shadow made his way there. He sniffed all around, then sat. Not whining, not curling up. Just sitting. As if asking the room itself, "Is this still home?" Elias stood in the doorway, eyes locked on the scene. He didn't need to say anything. That image, the silhouette of a German shepherd sitting in the same exact spot, said more than words ever could. Night fell. Elias placed a clean bowl of water beside the rug and dusted off the old food dish. He warmed up dinner and set it down. Shadow ate slowly, not with the desperation of a stray, but not with the calm of the old days either. Every bite felt deliberate, as if he were tasting each one just to make sure. This wasn't a dream. Elias straightened the blanket and turned on the little radio on his nightstand. Not music, but something older. A canine training recording, lesson 17. The speaker's voice rang out, crisp and familiar. "Shadow, sit. Good boy." And right on cue, the sound of Shadow's bark played through the speaker, clear as daylight, captured years ago. But the real Shadow didn't bark. He just lifted his head, ears twitching slightly. After a long pause, Shadow got up, hopped onto the bed without asking, without hesitation. He leaned his back into Elias's leg and let out a long, tired sigh. Elias gave a soft chuckle. "Yeah, same spot as before." Before falling asleep, Elias glanced down at his feet. Shadow was curled tightly, eyes closed, but ears still tilted upward, always listening. Just like that final night before their last mission in Kandahar. Only difference now, Shadow wasn't going anywhere. The first 3 nights passed in calm, unspoken peace. But on the 4th, something shifted. At 3 a.m, Elias jolted awake. Not from a dream, but from the sound of soft footsteps. Not human. The light tapping of claws on hardwood, steady and unhurried. As if someone were patrolling the house. Elias sat up without turning on the light. Moonlight spilled through the sheer curtain, casting a pale streak across the floor. And there was Shadow, standing at the living room window. Silent. Ears up. Eyes wide. Elias didn't speak. He moved slowly, careful not to startle him. That posture wasn't relaxed. Shadow's neck was slightly extended, nose twitching, tail motionless. Elias knew that stance. He had seen it just before a raid. Every time Shadow stood like that, it meant something was off. "Shadow," Elias called quietly. Shadow didn't turn. He stepped forward, pressing his nose to the glass. Outside, everything was still. The old wooden fence, the bare peach trees near the front. No movement, no sound. But Shadow didn't blink. Elias came closer and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Shadow flinched, then exhaled sharply, not in fear, but like he'd just released a breath he'd been holding far too long. Then he turned his head, nudged his muzzle into Elias's hand, and followed him back to the bedroom without resistance. The next morning, Elias went out earlier than usual, not because of suspicion, but because of that feeling, the one soldiers never forget, that survival instinct. The back door was still locked, the fence untouched, but the patch of soil beneath the second peach tree had been disturbed, just a little. Not enough for most to notice. But Elias noticed. It was a sign. That afternoon, Shadow didn't nap. Every few hours he returned to the window, checking again and again. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. But each time he came back in, his steps were slower. His tail no longer gave those small, hopeful wags like before. By midnight, when Elias turned on the radio like he did every night, Shadow wasn't curled at the foot of the bed anymore. He was sitting upright, facing the door that led to the porch. Not a sound came from him, but his eyes once again were not the eyes of a dog at rest. They were the eyes of a soldier, waiting for orders. Elias sat up, grabbed his jacket, and walked out onto the porch. Shadow moved beside him, silent and steady. The yard was still, wind brushing through the trees, the faint rustle of dry leaves the only noise in the air. But Shadow remained frozen in place, muscles tight. Then suddenly, his ears twitched. His gaze shifted toward the far left corner of the yard. Elias hadn't even turned to look when Shadow stepped forward. Just one step. No lunging. No growl. He simply positioned himself between Elias and the dark, blocking the path. "Is someone out there?" Elias whispered. Shadow didn't respond, but his ears stayed locked, eyes focused like twin searchlights scanning the shadows. For the first time, Elias didn't just feel something was off. He knew. Someone out there was watching them. That afternoon, soft golden sunlight poured across the wooden porch behind the house. Elias stepped out with a brush in one hand and a cloth in the other, and sat on the old, creaky chair. He laid the cloth gently across his knees and gave a small wave. Shadow came out quietly, easing down onto his side beside him. His eyes were half closed, and his tail gave a soft, familiar wag, like this moment, this ritual of calm, had become his new normal. No more explosions, no more commands. There were only slow, silent strokes of peace. Elias began brushing from the back, moving gently along the spine. Shadow's thick coat was a mix of ash gray and scattered white strands, weathered by time. With every tuft of fur that stuck to the cloth, Elias smoothed it down again, not just to untangle it, but as if he were slowly unraveling the past. Then Elias reached the underside. His hand froze. Beneath the soft, matted fur, a scar emerged, harsh, jagged, wrapped around the torso like something had once bound him. Maybe a chain, maybe a shock collar. The skin there had thickened, darkened, and become patchy in places as though burned or infected long ago. Elias didn't move. He just stared, heart tightening in his chest. Shadow didn't flinch. He didn't make a sound, didn't turn his head, didn't raise a paw in protest. He just lay there, still and silent. But after a while, as if sensing Elias's pause, Shadow slowly tilted his head. His eyes, the same eyes that had once faced down fire and sand, glanced sideways. No fear, no blame, only a quiet look, as if to say, "It's okay now." Elias bit down hard on his lip. He gently brushed aside the fur near Shadow's left shoulder. Another mark surfaced, thinner but deep. It looked like the lash of a whip, or something sharp dragged across skin. On his neck, just below the edge of the ear, was a patch of rough, darkened skin. The fur there was gone. Elias touched it lightly. It felt like something had clamped down on that spot for a very long time. Shadow didn't flinch. He just breathed, slow and steady. His whole body was soft, resigned, like this was just another part of him now, something he had grown used to carrying. Elias dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around Shadow. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He simply pulled the dog closer, holding tight around the neck that had once been muzzled, the back that had once caught bullets, and the chest that still bore scars. The breeze stirred under the porch awning. The cloth slipped from Elias's knee to the floorboards. And then the ache inside him surged up, not like a cry, not like tears, but like a whisper stuck in his throat. "Where have you been all this time, Shadow?" There was no answer, just the steady, warm breath of a dog who had somehow made it home. And in that breath, Elias felt it, the old trust, still alive, still there, despite the wounds. He picked up the old stainless steel bowl, wiped it clean, filled it with fresh water, and set it beside Shadow's paw. "What do you say we sleep out here tonight?" he said, his voice softer than usual, like he was talking to a child. Shadow didn't bark. He just rested his chin on Elias's leg and closed his eyes. As the sun dipped behind the trees, their shadows stretched long across the porch, one man, one dog. And in that quiet space, something unspoken passed between them, a truth that needed no explanation, just presence. Night fell quicker than usual. Elias sat at his small desk inside, the warm light of the desk lamp glowing over a worn folder. On its faded cover, a barely legible stamp still remained. Task Force Orion, K9 Division, 42B. From the drawer, Elias pulled out a small USB and plugged it into his laptop. The screen blinked to life. A file popped up. Operation Firedust, final debrief. His hand trembled slightly as he clicked play. The screen filled with the image of scorched land, the golden earth of Kandahar baking under a sun that burned at over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The camera shook slightly. A commander's voice crackled through an earpiece. "Target moving west! Team 2 ready. Deploy K9 first." Then Shadow appeared at the edge of the frame. Black tactical vest. Code 42. B stamped boldly across his back, the leash held in his mouth, his eyes laser-focused, ears standing tall, no barking, no hesitation, just the still, alert posture of a warrior who knew exactly what he was there to do. Elias remembered that moment. Before the blast. Before the blood. When all they had was the blistering wind and the burnt scent of sand threading through every seam of their uniforms. Shadow charged forward, overtaking 3 soldiers who were trying to flank a tattered tent. Then suddenly the siren blared. In that split second, Elias had screamed, "Shadow, fall back!" But Shadow didn't stop, not even for a heartbeat. The camera shook violently. A blinding white flash swallowed the entire frame. Then static. Signal lost. Elias closed the laptop. Not because it hurt, but because he remembered. He remembered the way Shadow had turned to look back at him just a second before the blast. That one look had said everything. No fear, no hesitation. Only one message shining in those eyes. Someone in there needs saving. Elias leaned down and opened a drawer. He pulled out an old photograph. One corner still had a rust-colored stained dried blood that never came out. In the photo, Shadow stood proudly in a dust-strewn field, wearing his K9 vest. Behind him, Elias stood with a weary smile, eyes tired but hand resting firmly on Shadow's head. That photo was taken just days before the final mission. Shadow's head was high, his mouth slightly open like mid-bark, his tail low but gently swaying, as if saying, "Don't worry, I've got you." Elias pressed the photo to his forehead and closed his eyes. Beside him, Shadow lay stretched across the floor, breathing steadily. No more vests, no more commands, but in every movement the instinct remained, ready to give everything to protect the one he loved. Elias looked at him not as a dog who had vanished 3 years ago, but as a brother in arms who had somehow come back from a place no one returns from. A deep breath filled Elias's lungs. No more nightmares. No more asking, "Why, Shadow?" Because now Elias finally understood. In those fleeting moments between life and death, some souls don't need orders. They only need love. The next morning the sky was quiet and blue. Elias carefully placed the collar back around Shadow's neck. It had been cleaned and polished, the rust scrubbed away. The number 42B was still faintly engraved. Then he leaned down, gave a little pat, and whispered, "Let's go for a walk." The western park on the edge of town was just as quiet as always. Fallen leaves blanketed the stone path. A few children ran across the grass, playing tag. An older man sat on a bench reading the paper. A place where nothing seemed urgent anymore. Shadow walked close to Elias without a leash. He didn't need one. Each step was slow, firm, and mindful, as if he was still listening. To the world, to the wind, to whatever might come. When Elias stopped in front of the little cafe by the lake, Shadow lay down right beside the door, his back to the street, eyes wide open. He wasn't resting. He was guarding. Elias settled onto a stone bench with a hot coffee in hand, his gaze drifting toward the playground across the way. Sunlight filtered through the trees, falling in broken patches that pulsed like breath. Everything felt peaceful, until the sound of breaking glass cracked through the stillness. In a far corner of the park, a middle-aged man was shouting, one hand gripping a glass bottle. His voice was harsh, his posture threatening. The woman next to him stepped back, shielding a crying child in her arms. Before Elias could react, Shadow was already on his feet. No barking, no growling. Just a silent sprint forward, placing himself squarely between Elias and the commotion. His body locked tight, head lowered, eyes sharp. Then came a low snarl, quiet but unmistakable. Anyone who'd ever been to war would recognize it instantly. It was the stance of a warrior ready to fight. The man froze. He didn't take another step. His hand, clenched around the bottle, began to tremble, then loosened. The bottle slipped from his fingers and clinked onto the stone walkway. Elias stood up fast and moved forward. Shadow didn't budge. He stood like a silent wall, holding the line between danger and peace. "Shadow," Elias said gently. "It's okay now." Shadow flicked his eyes to Elias, as if to ask, "Are you sure?" Only then did he back away, slowly, returning to Elias's side. No need for a treat, no command, no praise, just the knowledge that the person he was meant to protect was safe. On the way home, Elias kept looking at Shadow. But it wasn't the look of a pet owner. It was the look of someone who had once stood on the knife's edge between life and death, and understood what that quiet stare meant. Shadow didn't react to strangers. He didn't chase out of instinct. He only moved when real danger appeared. That instinct hadn't faded. He was still Shadow the combat dog trained to run toward the threat, not away from it. Only now, the danger didn't come from a battlefield. It was something else, something getting closer. That night, Elias returned to the old training room. He cleared it out, tossed the broken rails, pulled down the faded signs, and on the main wall he hung a new photograph. Shadow, no vest, no gear, lying peacefully in a field of grass, the light stretching gently across his face. Beneath it, Elias had written a simple line in black ink. "You don't have to be ready anymore. Now you just get to stay." Shadow lay beside the window. His eyes closed, but his ears still listened. Because maybe that instinct never really went to sleep. That morning, rain tapped gently against the tin roof. Not loud, just soft enough to feel like the world was being washed clean. Elias woke earlier than usual, not for anything urgent, just a quiet pull in his chest like someone had whispered through a dream. "It's time." He walked straight to the old storage room behind the garage. In the far corner sat a weathered steel chest, its rusted latch clinging to a rotting wooden shelf. Elias brushed away the dust and opened it. A wave of old paper and damp metal filled the air, dragging up a memory he hadn't touched in years. Inside, mission records, discharge papers, photos from the field, and one thick gray folder marked in bold, K9, Code 42B. Elias's hand paused. He opened the file and began turning pages. Every detail was familiar training specs, reflex indexes, operation logs. Each line was a stamp across his memory. Every mission, every drill, every night he'd sat beside Shadow, his hand running down that warm, steady back, like checking the rhythm of his own heart. He flipped to the last page, the section labeled Operational Status. His eyes stopped. There was no KIA, no killed in action, no certificate, no closure. Only one phrase stared back at him. MIA, missing in action. A chill ran down his spine. Elias stared at the letters, afraid that if he blinked, they might disappear. For 3 years, Elias had carried a quiet, aching truth, believing Shadow had died. That the dog who leapt into danger to save him didn't survive. That the cost of living had been losing the one soul who never left his side. But now, right here, in this folder of silent words, was something no one ever told him. Shadow had never been confirmed dead. The past surged through him like the dust of Kandahar, choking everything in its path. He remembered. After the blast, they rushed him into surgery. He was unconscious for 2 days, and when he finally woke up, the first person he saw was a young nurse. Her voice had been almost too gentle to hear. "Mr. Granger, I'm sorry. Shadow didn't make it." That was it. No report, no memorial. No one ever returned Shadow's collar, Code 42B, the one Elias had always believed would be placed in his hands as a final goodbye, just one sentence, and he had believed it. Now, staring at MIA, burned into that page, Elias felt something snap inside, not anger, but a question that had never been answered. Where had Shadow been all this time, and why? Did no one ever go looking? Where had Shadow been? Who kept him? And why? Elias clutched the file, flipping through it over and over, eyes scanning every word like a man searching for a hidden code. But that was it. The file ended there. The final page offered no conclusion. No signature, no red government seal, just an unfinished ending. That afternoon, Elias sat on the floor by the window. Shadow curled up beside him again, his big head resting gently on Elias's knee, eyes barely open. Elias set the file down, his hand slowly brushing along Shadow's spine over the scars on his belly, over bones that once jutted through skin like bars on a cage. Then, in a low voice, barely louder than a breath, he murmured, "Shadow, if someone tried to hide this, I'll find out. Not because I'm curious, but because I owe you the truth." That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The warm kitchen light cast soft shadows that danced across the wall. His phone sat on the table. Behind it glowed a name he hadn't said out loud in years, Lieutenant Colonel Reddick. Elias scrolled through his old contacts, hesitated, then pressed call. "Granger?" The voice on the other end was deep and rough, but not unfamiliar. Before Elias could even form a sentence, the man asked again, "You still have the collar? 42B?" Elias froze. "Shadow is alive," he said carefully. "And I have the file. It never said he died." Silence. Then a long, heavy sigh spilled through the speaker, like someone finally setting down a weight they were never supposed to carry. "I know." Reddick told him to wait 5 minutes for a call from a secure line. And right on time, it came this time, video. On screen, Elias saw a face older than he remembered. But the eyes? They were just as sharp as the day they first met at the K9 training base. "I always suspected something," Reddick began. "After the Kandahar incident, I tried to pull Shadow's file, got blocked. The reason they gave? Classified for research delegation." "Sound familiar?" Elias gave a slow nod. "I think Shadow wasn't lost because he failed," he said quietly. "He was taken because he was too good." Reddick tapped a few keys. A classified document popped up on the screen. Elias spotted an unfamiliar logo in the bottom corner. Virion Dynamics. "That's the name you'll want to remember," Reddick said. "They're a third-party firm. Got clearance to acquire K9 units after deployment, supposedly for behavioral and combat reflex research." "You're saying they sold the dogs?" Elias asked, his voice cracking. "Not officially, but in under 2 years, over 30 high-performance K9s were recalled due to accidents. Not a single one came back. Not a single death certificate." Elias felt it like every nerve in his body was being pulled taut. His pulse hammered against his ribs like a war drum of rage. "Virion filed for Pentagon funding under this phrase, K9 Behavioral Analysis for AI Combat Application. Sound familiar?" Elias didn't answer. Reddick sent a file. There it was, 42B, Shadow, transferred under Class Delta V. Below it, a faded note. "Reprogram potential non-lethal use only." A dog who didn't die, who wasn't freed, just kept. Not as a living soul, but as a tool. Outside, the rain had grown heavier, tapping hard against the windows like fingers trying to get in. Elias turned off the screen. Sat in the dark. Only the wind and the sound of water filled the room. Shadow lay nearby, eyes closed, his breathing steady, like some quiet metronome of memory. Elias slowly stood, picked the file back up from the table, and turned it over. Nothing on the back. But as the desk lamp cast a slanted beam across the folder's spine, something shimmered an uneven layer of glue near the binding, like a page had been torn out. Elias slipped a thin blade beneath the binding, peeled gently, and out fluttered a small piece of paper. No title, no case number, just a single handwritten line. "Check item VX-D9 transferred October 3rd via Bluebird route." Elias didn't know what VX-D9 meant. But Bluebird route? That rang a bell. It was a secure military transport line, often reserved for black site air transfers or quarantined cargo. He reached for his phone, pulled up an old military intranet login, two-factor authentication password, fingerprint. Nearly 30 minutes passed, fingers scrolling, digging, tracing cold digital trails. Until finally, a single backup file surfaced, buried in a 2020 database leak. VX-D9 appeared on the list. Filed beneath, Canine Behavioral Asset, Subject Delta V Class, Location, Redacted, Handler, NA, no name, no contact, no location. Shadow, officially, belonged to no one. Elias stared at that one line. Location, redacted. The destination erased clean, as if it had never existed. But then something clicked. All the related files shared one consistent prefix at the top of each page, VRN-07, and Reddick had said it, Virion Dynamics. Elias dove into his old inbox, filtering through dusty military communications. Emails from forgotten years, old intel briefings, archived links. Finally, a name surfaced. VRN-07, Texas facility, Ridgeview sector. A speck of a compound wedged in the dry highlands of western Texas, just east of a decommissioned mining site. No signage, no public records, no access. But then Elias remembered 3 months ago, he'd skimmed a short article buried on a local news site. Residents report barking and metallic clanging from Ridgeview mine officials declined to comment. His hand slammed the desk. The pieces snapped into place like scattered memories finally falling back into alignment. Near midnight, Elias stepped out the back door. The wind was sharp, the dry scent of prairie grass mixed with a faint trace of machine oil. Shadow was already there, not waiting to be called, not needing permission, just quietly, firmly, standing beside him. Elias didn't speak. He only reached down and fastened the collar again that faded 42B, still etched along the tag, a worn symbol of something unbreakable. Shadow, looks like it's not time to rest just yet. He popped the trunk, pulled out the file, and set it on the passenger seat. Shadow jumped into the back like it was second nature. No bark, no sound, just his gaze locked on the road ahead. Exactly like that last day in Kandahar, only this time Elias would be the one leading. Not into war, but toward the light of the truth. This time, it wasn't a battlefield Elias was leading Shadow into. It was something even more uncertain than the light of the truth. The night in the small town was unusually still. The wind brushed softly across the back lawn, whispering stories only those who had once lost something could truly hear. In the quiet bedroom, a dim lamp glowed on the nightstand. The ceiling fan ticked softly overhead, and Elias lay still, breathing slow and steady after a long, heavy day. Then a subtle movement. Shadow rose, not in a rush, not with alarm, just standing, calm and alert, as if the entire world had stopped breathing. Elias didn't wake immediately, but the shape of Shadow's silhouette, cast on the wall by the soft lamplight, gradually pulled his eyes open. There were no sudden sounds, no clear noise to trigger concern. And yet, something in the air had shifted. He sat up, quiet, reaching for the wool sweater draped over the back of the chair. Shadow hadn't moved, his gaze fixed on the front yard, where the night had swallowed every outline and form into its deepening black. Then Elias heard it. Not an engine, not the crunch of tires over gravel. It was something more subtle, a sound hard to describe, like air being sliced, like the faint tremor of rubber slipping quietly over asphalt. A sound designed to stay unnoticed. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The wind tugged lightly at his sweater, and in that exact moment, as the beam of his flashlight swept across the road, he saw it. A white van. No headlights, no license plate. The windows were pitch black, reflecting the beam back like a sheet of frozen water. You couldn't see in, and you couldn't see who, if anyone, was behind the wheel. The van crept by at an unnerving pace, not fast, not loud, just slow enough to avoid suspicion, but slow enough to be noticed by anyone paying attention. A feeling crawled across Elias's skin like cold fingers down his spine. He took a step forward, lifting the flashlight to catch the tail of the van, but it had already turned down a side street and slipped behind a line of old willow trees, swallowed by the dark. Elias stood there a long moment, unmoving. Then he turned. Shadow hadn't budged from his place by the front door, still watching, still fixed in the direction the van had gone. He hadn't blinked. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Still Shadow didn't move. His eyes darkened in the low light, not from fear but from recognition. It was as if something old, something buried deep, had been stirred awake. And then a single bark, not loud, not angry, just one. Low, crisp, final, like a signal being sent. Then Shadow sat down, back straight, steady, eyes locked on Elias, waiting for the next move. Elias didn't need to ask. This wasn't a dog reacting to something unfamiliar. It wasn't instinct. It was the calculated stillness of a soldier, not reacting out of fear, but out of recognition. Shadow wasn't sensing danger. Shadow had already identified it. Elias stepped closer and knelt down, resting a hand gently on Shadow's head. The wind outside still moved through the trees, carrying the scent of damp leaves and something deeper. The kind of night air that feels like it remembers things long forgotten. "Something's looking for you, isn't it?" Elias whispered, though it sounded more like he was speaking to himself. Shadow didn't respond, just tilted his head slightly and exhaled, soft and steady, his gaze fixed on the window. The same spot where that strange van's headlights had flashed past. And that's when Elias understood. They weren't just two souls who had once been summoned to the battlefield. They were being called again. But this time, it wasn't by any mission written in orders or filed in records. This time it was something else, something that had lived quietly in the shadows, waiting. And now, their real journey was about to begin. Elias reached for his phone. His fingers trembled slightly. It was well past midnight, but there was no way he could wait for morning. After a few rings, the line clicked. "Granger?" came Reddick's gravelly voice, laced with the rustle of papers in the background. "Reddick, I need to tell you something." Elias told him everything. The white van, the way Shadow froze like stone, that single deep bark that didn't carry anger, only certainty, and most of all, that feeling that something had reached into a layer of memory they'd both tried to bury. There was a brief grunt on the other end, then the sound of typing, rapid and firm, as if Reddick was already chasing down the ghosts Elias had just awakened. "The plates are fake, but traffic cams at the intersections picked it up. We got timestamps and GPS logs. The van's tied to a logistics firm called Trident Axis." Elias squinted, scribbling the name onto a scrap of paper beside him. "Trident used to handle equipment transfers for Virion Dynamics labs down south," Reddick continued. "But here's the odd part. In their bankruptcy records, there's a route that was never disclosed publicly. It's listed as Bluebird Route, and the only name ever attached to that route, Shadow." The line went quiet for a few long seconds. Then Reddick spoke again, lower this time. "Elias, you're not just uncovering the truth," Reddick said slowly. "You're digging into the one thing they've worked the hardest to bury, a lost asset." Elias turned his head. Shadow was lying beside the table, but not asleep. One front leg curled slightly inward, like the ghost of a memory, as if it had once been bound. His eyes stayed open, fixed on a spot in the dark. "And if Shadow really was a loyal partner," Reddick continued, "taken without cause, survived God knows what, and somehow made it back, but never recognized as a veteran, never honored as a dog who served, just treated like some ordinary object." Reddick didn't have to say the rest. They wouldn't let this go. And then came the final line that made Elias feel ice slip down his spine. "To them, Shadow's not a dog anymore. He's classified as a test subject." Elias clenched his fists until the nails pressed deep into his palms. The image of Shadow burned in his mind. Still here. Still breathing. Still part of a truth nobody dared to face. "I'll send you the internal documents," Reddick said, his voice low. "And the name of the man who used to run the DARC program Dog Adaptive Reconditioning Command for K9 units." He paused. "But Elias, once you get involved in this, there's no turning back." The next morning, the sky hung heavy with gray, and a thin mist blanketed the earth. Wind slipped under the eaves and hissed quietly, like something old and waiting. Elias had just poured a cup of coffee when Shadow moved to the window. He didn't bark, didn't glance back, just stood there, motionless, staring out into the backyard. Elias followed his gaze, and his breath caught. There, beside the bushes in a spot completely hidden from the main road, was a tire track. Deep, clear, fresh. Not the kind that comes from someone turning around in a driveway. This was a full stop, like whoever had been there, had parked, waited, watched, then drove away without a sound. Elias walked over. Kneeling down, he brushed away some of the dry grass. Beneath it, something small and copper glinted in the light, a slender wire, the tip slightly curled, wrapped in thin black rubber. Looked like nothing more than a scrap from an old kitchen appliance. He turned it slowly in his fingers, then looked up at Shadow. Shadow was still standing a few feet away, eyes locked on the thing in Elias's hand. That feeling came rushing back, not fear, but a bone-deep alertness, the kind Elias hadn't felt since his time in uniform. Like every nerve in his body had suddenly remembered what it meant to be hunted. From morning until noon, every time Elias even touched his phone, even just to glance at the screen, Shadow would lift his head. Ears perked. And then, silently, move into position right in front of him, not out of habit, but out of instinct. Something old, something awakened, and maybe something coming. He kept staring at the front door, not sniffing, not pacing, just scanning, like he was tuned to something faint and unnatural, as if he'd once been trained to respond to a frequency or signal that didn't belong to this world. Elias pulled up the porch security footage and rewound to 2 nights ago. Timestamp 0017. There it was. A white van drifting past, slow and deliberate. No headlights, no plates. It only appeared for a brief second, lit up by the neighbor's motion sensor across the fence. The next night, same time, same van, same eerie quiet. Elias switched over to the indoor feed. Both times, right when the van passed, Shadow, who had been fast asleep, suddenly rose to his feet, walked straight to the front door, and sat. Didn't bark, didn't pant, not a sound. Just alert, not scared, aware, like something deep inside him had stirred and recognized what no one else could. That afternoon, Elias drove to the local police station with a USB of the footage and the piece of copper wire in his pocket. The desk officer, probably mid-30s, was chewing gum as he half-glanced at the screen. Elias laid out everything: the tire tracks, the van with no license plate, and the strange, unshakable response from Shadow. The officer shrugged. "Probably just some local kids. I mean, who's got the time to stalk a dog in the middle of the night?" Elias didn't respond. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he already knew. From here on out, the answers he needed weren't going to come from people sitting behind desks. On the drive back, a memory surfaced from the very first week of training with Shadow. If a dog like Shadow is still awake, it's because he's already seen something you haven't. That night, Elias stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The steam from the shower fogged up the glass. He reached out, wiped it clean. In the reflection, he didn't see the same man anymore. His eyes weren't lonely now. Because standing behind him, still as a statue, was Shadow, watching him, unmoving, unblinking, and completely focused. He didn't make a sound, but his presence said it all. Shadow was on guard, silent, resolute, tense in that quiet way that says, "I've done this before." It wasn't just about protecting Shadow anymore. Elias knew that now. This wasn't about a missing dog. It was about something bigger, something buried deep under layers of silence, something no one had dared to speak out loud. And now, piece by piece, it was starting to rise, under the weight of instinct, suspicion, and one unbreakable bond. The tiny office was soaked in silence. The only light in the room came from the computer screen, casting a bluish glow across Elias's face. His jaw was tight, his brow furrowed in that deep, steady way that happens when every line on the screen feels like it might open a door or a wound. The document Reddick had sent was labeled in the plainest font. K9, Special Transfer Registry, Class Delta V. Elias scrolled through, each name slicing open old scars that had never really healed, until he reached one. K942B, Maximus. Attached beneath the line was a blurry photo, along with a faint tag. Most recent behavioral reconditioning, trace code 42DX. He clicked. The image expanded slowly, washing his face in pale light. His eyes, already tired, began to turn glassy. The dog in the picture was a German shepherd. Charcoal coat with a silvery burnish, upright ears, eyes sharp and guarded. But the detail that stopped him cold was the scar wrapping clean around the belly, the exact same scar Shadow had carried back from Kandahar. But the name wasn't Shadow. It was Maximus. A heavy stillness took hold of the room. Elias let go of the mouse and lowered his head. His eyes closed. His breath caught. "Maximus," he whispered, the name foreign on a face he'd never forgotten. Something in him twisted. Not just anger, not just grief. It was the eerie sense that someone had stolen a part of Shadow, repackaged it, renamed it, buried it behind sterile documents and clinical labels. But the past doesn't vanish just because it's been renamed. He turned from the screen and opened the bottom drawer of his old filing cabinet. Inside was a weathered field notebook, edges curled from heat and time. Elias flipped through until he found the page he was looking for. Scribbled in his old handwriting were the words, "Verbal reflex cue, handwritten in case of loss, Shadow, search." He didn't hesitate. Elias crouched down, eyes locking on Shadow, who lay just a few steps away. He spoke slowly, clearly. "Shadow, search." There was no immediate movement, but then, like something stirring deep beneath calm water, Shadow lifted his head. His ears twitched low, then stood again. His eyes blinked once, then twice. And they didn't look at the floor or the room. They fixed right on Elias. He didn't move. He didn't bark. But that look, sharp, trained, waiting, was the look Elias had memorized back at the base. It hit like a punch to the chest. He didn't need proof anymore. Elias turned back to the desk, pulled up the file, and opened the edit field under Identifier. He typed K942B, Shadow, then clicked Save. No one has the right to take away the real name of a dog who once saved a life. No one has the right to erase the past with the stroke of a key. Shadow was still here, and Shadow had never forgotten who he was. He had simply been forced to live beneath a name that never belonged to him. Elias sat still for a long moment. The wind outside began to press harder through the cracks in the doorframe, making the window pane tremble with each gust, as if nature itself was whispering a warning that something was getting closer. Some pasts, no matter how deeply buried, know when to rise again, and some memories, no matter how often renamed, are carved deeper than any number or code ever written. Shadow, Unit K942B, was never Maximus. Never. Elias sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the fresh printout Reddick had just sent. The page was thin, but it carried the weight of 3 years of stolen time. One name stood out in the internal roster: Silas Creed, Director of Strategic Operations, Virion Dynamics. Elias's eyes paused at the bottom corner. A small, clean note, but it hit like a blade. Transfer of subject K942B. Custodial rights confirmed, Creed. He didn't need to read further. When he looked up, Shadow was standing by the window, completely still. But his entire body was stretched tight, like a bowstring drawn to its limit. Elias said the name, softly, only once. Creed. Immediately, Shadow turned. There was no barking, no frenzy, just a low, ragged growl so deep it seemed to rise from somewhere buried inside his chest, from a place that hadn't been touched in years. The fur along Shadow's back bristled. His eyes went darker, pupils narrowed and fixed, like he was bracing for something, not shaking but waiting. Watching Elias, not asking for permission. It was something else. A hesitation that looked like a question, tilted ever so slightly in the head, those eyes locked on Elias like they were searching for understanding. Elias stepped closer, hand extended but not touching just yet. He looked into Shadow's eyes. And there, in that depth, was something that couldn't be explained. This wasn't instinct, this wasn't training, it was trauma. He hadn't seen that look in years, not since those early days on base, when Shadow was first learning to tell the difference between a command and a trap. Elias crouched low, his voice soft and steady. "It was him, wasn't it?" Shadow turned immediately. No barking, no snarling, just a deep, guttural growl. It came from somewhere buried far inside him, thick and raw, like it had been sealed away for years, and was finally clawing its way back out. The fur on Shadow's back stood on edge. His eyes darkened, locked onto Elias with an intensity that didn't waver. He didn't tremble. He didn't flinch. He simply waited, posture frozen, not for permission, but for understanding. He tilted his head slightly, studying Elias like he was asking the question without words. Elias stepped closer, reaching out his hand, but stopped short of touching. He looked into Shadow's eyes, and what he saw wasn't just alertness. It wasn't instinct. It was trauma. A look Elias hadn't seen in years. Not since the early days of training at base camp, when Shadow was still learning the difference between a command and a trap. Elias crouched low, his voice soft and steady. "It was him, wasn't it?" Shadow didn't move, but Elias felt it, an unease rising through the silence, that deep, unsettled pull inside, whispering that this wasn't just a memory. It was something still alive. He opened the supplemental file. Under the section labeled Neural Conditioning History, Delta V Subject, one nearly erased line appeared. Subject displays heightened response to verbal trigger Creed, emotional regulation, incomplete. In the corner, a note. Logged by DARC Camp 12, Level B Lab. Elias closed his eyes and pressed his lips together. He had hoped, if Shadow survived, that maybe, just maybe, he had been sent somewhere safe. Some recovery facility, a home. Not left to be poked and wired and broken in a lab coat world where nothing had a name, only a barcode. A dog doesn't get to choose who holds the leash. But now, Shadow was free of leashes. Elias turned his gaze back. Shadow was right there beside the chair, unmoving, eyes pinned on the open file as if he could read every word. And then Elias spoke. Quietly. Not as an order, but as a vow to an old friend. I won't let that name show up in your life again. Not ever. I promise. Shadow lowered his head gently and touched his nose to Elias's leg. It was such a small gesture, but it held the weight of complete trust. And Elias understood. From that moment on, this wasn't just about uncovering a buried memory. This was about reclaiming something sacred. Shadow's name. Shadow's identity. A name that had been erased, stripped from every system, now had to be returned to where it truly belonged, not in the hands of those who had never seen him as a sentient soul. This was no longer a mission. It was a promise. Elias picked up his phone. His voice was low, calm, and final. I need everything you have on Silas Creed. Where he lives, where he moves, and the things he's worked hardest to hide. There was a pause on the other end. Reddick exhaled slowly. Understood. But are you sure? Once this starts, there's no way back. Elias set the phone down, his eyes still locked onto the old file. He didn't need to say a word. His face said everything. Something had shifted inside him. Something deep. Something loud. 3 years. His voice was barely above a whisper, but every syllable landed heavy. For 3 years, Shadow was treated like a tool, while I sat here thinking he was finally at peace. Shadow stepped closer. No bark, no growl, just gently resting his head on Elias's lap, as if to say, I'm still here. Elias placed his hand on Shadow's neck, tracing the scars that coiled cold and long beneath his fur. They weren't just marks. They were questions, left unanswered for far too long. He turned back to the desk and reprinted the file. This time the name at the top was changed by his own hand. Re-identified, K942B = Shadow. Beneath the signature line, Elias added one final sentence. The ink was bold and steady, like a verdict delivered after years of silence. Shadow was detained without justification. It's time he got his name back, and the justice he deserves. Then, quietly, he opened a drawer and took out his old sidearm, the one he swore he'd never use again. But Elias knew now. Some vows are only kept until justice is taken away. Then they become something else entirely. A reason to act. A reason to finish what should never have been started. Shadow stayed curled at Elias's feet, his breathing slow and warm. Elias reached down and placed a hand gently along Shadow's back. I won't let anyone hurt you again. Not ever. The night outside had fallen like a thick curtain, sealing everything beneath a dense stillness. Inside the tiny room, the soft yellow light from the desk lamp spilled into a fading halo across the wooden floor. Elias sat motionless, eyes fixed forward, shoulders tight with resolve. Behind him, Shadow remained alert, his gaze never wavering. They both faced the same direction, toward something invisible, something heavy with the weight of names once buried deep in darkness, now inching toward the light. I won't let anyone hurt you again. Not ever. Outside, the night pressed close, cloaking the small house like a secret kept too long. The faint glow of the lamp stretched a pale streak over the floor, barely enough to make out Elias at his desk. He sat still, a statue in the silence. And just behind him, like a shadow in both name and presence, Shadow stood as if carved from stone, unmoving, unblinking. Not a sound passed between them. Time itself seemed frozen. Wind hissed through the gaps in the doorframe, curling around tree branches and making them creak with voices only the dark could understand. But beneath that silence, something shifted. Shadow wasn't sleeping. Shadow stood rigid by the window, every muscle drawn tight. His tail hung low, his back arched slightly forward, his eyes locked on the pitch-black backyard, where nothing moved but the wind through the brush. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. But Elias knew that look. That was the look of a dog who once sensed death from miles away. Elias reached out and turned off the desk lamp. He was headed toward the bedroom when the light above them flickered, then snapped off. No warning, no flicker, just darkness total and sudden. He froze in place. A chill crawled up his spine like a cold hand. He pulled out his phone. No signal, no Wi-Fi, just the blank glow of a screen that read, "No connection." The worry sharpened into something heavier. Elias reached for the emergency flashlight he kept in the stairwell drawer, but before his fingers touched the handle. Clack, clack. A faint metallic sound echoed from the back door. Software precise. Not the wind, not rusted hinges. This was the sound of a tool, of someone picking a lock. Elias stopped breathing. Elias gripped the flashlight tighter, his knuckles white. He stepped down the stairs, slow and silent. Every inch of muscle moved with the precision of a man who had once walked battlefields. His instincts screamed that whoever was on the other side of that door was not just some curious kid. Then came the click. A faint, deliberate snap. The final lock had just been breached. Before Elias could react, a cold rush of air slapped him in the face. Sharp, bitter, laced with a chemical sting, chloroform, or something stronger, designed to drop a man fast, quiet, and clean. He staggered backward, one hand fumbling inside the drawer where his old handgun lay, the weapon he'd sworn he'd never touch again. His fingers brushed the grip just as his head began to spin. His vision blurred. His limbs started to fail him. Footsteps approached, unhurried, confident. No effort to hide. The intruder already knew Elias wouldn't be getting up. And then, in the space between one collapsing breath and the next, a blur of motion. Shadow. Not a sound. No bark. No growl. Just a blur of dark muscle cutting through the room like an arrow let loose from a bow drawn to breaking point. This wasn't instinct. It wasn't animal reflex. This was something else. This was the strike of a soldier, one who had waited 3 long years for the moment to defend the only family he had left. Shadow didn't hesitate, didn't check, didn't falter. In a heartbeat, he was across the room. His paws touched down with the weight of air itself, every sinew flexed tight, a storm in motion, and in the heavy silence, he moved like smoke, invisible, but unstoppable. The intruder was still hunched low, one hand reaching for the weapon at his hip, when Shadow hit. A whisper of breath, a crack like dry bone splitting. Shadow's jaws locked deep into the man's gun arm. A scream tore through the house, bone shattered, blood sprayed across the curtain fabric. The man shrieked, panicked and broken, flailing backward. But Shadow held. His grip never loosened. His power, absolute. This wasn't chaos, it was precision, 1,000 drills condensed into one explosive act. Shadow didn't let go. Not yet. When the intruder hit the ground, Shadow took half a step back but didn't retreat. He stayed right there, planted in front of Elias, spine arched, eyes locked and unblinking. No growl, no bark. Just a fiery gaze that seemed to burn a hole straight through the darkness. It wasn't just anger. It was a warning, a message that needed no translation. Touch Elias, and you won't make it out of here in one piece. The side door rattled. Another shadow slipped into the house, this one quieter, more refined, like someone trained not to be heard. But Shadow had already picked up on it. He turned, shifting smoothly to block the path. His eyes never left the figure. Ears up, breathing tight and measured. Then, just one bark, sharp, clean, and piercing. It cut through the walls like a signal flare, aimed straight at the ears of those waiting outside. Moments later, a storm of footsteps thundered through the yard. The porch light blazed to life, casting the yard in daylight. Flashlights beamed through the windows, sweeping across the room like searchlights. Reddick's voice roared out over the chaos. "FBI! Everybody down! Hands where we can see them!" The quiet little house, once just a shelter from the world, had turned into the epicenter of a tactical raid. Blue and red lights flashed wildly beyond the windows. The door burst open. Officers in full gear poured in. Shadow didn't move. He stayed right where he was, shielding Elias, who now lay on his side near the desk, one hand still gripping the drawer handle, eyes gently closed. Reddick was the first through the door. He saw everything in an instant, and froze. He didn't call out Shadow's name. He didn't shout any commands. He just stood there and looked. He looked at a K-9 soldier no longer enlisted, no longer counted but still fighting like he'd never been given permission to lay down arms. A warrior wrapped in fur, a soul once discarded. And that night, beneath the flare of floodlights and the wail of sirens, no one had any doubts left. Shadow wasn't just living evidence. Shadow was the reason the truth would finally be dragged into the light. A warrior, in the form of a dog the world once chose to forget. And under those swirling lights, that dog had just reminded them all he never forgot who he was. Elias lay unconscious. Right beside him, Shadow stood guard, chest squared over Elias's body, paws planted firm against the wooden floor, muscles rigid, mouth streaked with blood. The two intruders were sprawled across the room. One was out cold. The other groaned in agony, his arm twisted unnaturally where Shadow had broken it, blood spreading across the floor like spilled ink. No one moved. The room hung in stunned silence. Reddick stepped forward and crouched by the wounded man's arm. The bite was deep, strong, but not lethal. He looked up at Shadow, his voice barely a whisper. He knew when to stop. Another officer moved swiftly, pulling items from a black canvas bag. A combat knife, an unregistered handgun, a signal jammer. But what made the entire room hold their breath was a steel nameplate, glinting under the flashlight, etched with a mercenary unit's serial code. This wasn't some petty break-in, one officer murmured. They were trained and sent. Reddick's eyes shifted to Shadow, his face still marked with blood. But those eyes, they burned with clarity, with command. Not the eyes of a frightened animal, but those of a soldier, one doing exactly what he was born to do. Elias stirred. His eyelids trembled, then slowly opened. The first thing he saw was Shadow's eyes, gazing down at him. Shadow had curled beside him, his head resting on Elias's chest, breath calm and steady like the tide. Elias reached up, his fingers brushing the fur along Shadow's back. His voice cracked, heavy with emotion. "You're really here." Shadow didn't move, but something in his body softened, like a weight had finally been lifted after years of silent waiting. Reddick knelt beside them and placed a firm hand on Elias's shoulder. "We just touched something bigger than we thought, and the people keeping it buried won't stay quiet for long." Elias slowly sat up, leaning back against the old wooden chair, his hand still resting gently on Shadow's head, like it was the one solid thing he could hold on to while the world spun out of control. In the dim glow from the flashlight that had rolled under the table for the first time since that explosion years ago, Elias didn't see a damaged creature. He saw a friend, a warrior, a reason to keep going. With his back pressed to the chair and his hand resting on Shadow like a promise, Elias finally understood. Shadow wasn't just a dog. Shadow was what was left of everything worth fighting for. The front door slammed open without warning. In rushed the local police and Reddick's tactical unit, armor-clad and weapons raised, flashlight beams sweeping through the space like searchlights in a battlefield. But as their lights passed over the living room, everyone froze. Elias lay unconscious on the floor. Right over his chest stood Shadow, unmoving. The German Shepherd's body blocked Elias like a living shield. Blood stained the corners of Shadow's mouth. Just feet away, the two intruders were down. One lay completely limp, out cold. The other clutched a shattered arm, moaning in pain. Blood from his wound soaked into the rug, painting it red thread by thread. No one said a word. The room fell into a silence so heavy it chilled to the bone. Only the sound of ragged breathing and stunned disbelief lingered in the air. Reddick stepped closer, crouching beside the groaning mercenary. The bite mark was vicious, deep, and unforgiving, but deliberately placed. It missed any artery or fatal spot. Reddick exhaled, casting his eyes toward Shadow, murmuring almost to himself. He knew when to stop. Another officer opened a tactical bag left behind. Inside were items that made every stomach turn: a military-grade dagger, an untraceable handgun, a mobile signal jammer, and a professional lock-picking kit. But it was the last item that turned the room to stone. A cold steel nameplate, the kind worn only by contract soldiers. Its numbers were engraved deep, no mistake about what kind of men these were. A young officer broke the silence. These weren't burglars. Someone paid them to come here. Shadow hadn't moved. He stood like a statue carved from instinct and memory. His eyes were locked onto the man writhing in pain, not with hatred, not with fear. Just a calm, measured stare. The stare of a protector who had waited too long for this moment. Elias stirred. At first, his vision was blurry, swimming in the low light, but he could feel warmth pressed against him like a heartbeat outside his own body. Shadow's head rested softly on his chest. His breath slowed, rhythmic, steady. A quiet signal in the chaos, whispering, "It's over now." Elias raised his hand, his fingers finding the thick fur at the back of Shadow's neck. He ran his hand along the coat, warm, soft, and trembling slightly beneath his touch. It was real. So was the moment. Like his own pulse, coming back to him. "You're really here." No more words were needed, no explanation, just that feeling. Shadow hadn't left, Shadow hadn't turned away, and in that moment, Elias knew something had returned. Not a memory, but a vow, a promise made in dust and gunpowder, now alive again in breath, in muscle, in unshakable loyalty. Reddick knelt beside them, his expression softening, voice low. "This isn't just your story anymore, Elias. They know you still have him. And trust me, they will come back." Elias didn't flinch. He didn't argue, didn't show fear. He simply nodded. One hand still resting on Shadow's head, the other curling slightly, firm and quiet like a vow pressed into skin. A promise without words, and a line no one would be allowed to cross again. Outside, sirens howled in steady pulses. Red and blue lights flashed endlessly across the window pane. But inside that small room, only two figures remained in silence. A soldier who once forgot who he was, and a dog who had once been written off as worthless. Elias leaned down, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke into Shadow's ear. "You're not alone anymore, and this time, no one has to run." The next morning arrived with a sky so clear it felt untouched. The forest breeze drifted softly through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. Elias walked with Shadow along the narrow trail that wound through the woods, the same one they always followed after everything felt too much. Sunlight streamed through the canopy, dancing in golden shards across the moss-covered ground. Everything seemed quiet, peaceful even. But Shadow wasn't behaving like usual. There was no joyful trot, no nose twitching at every squirrel or leaf. His steps were low and measured. Tense. His ears stayed pricked. His tail hung down. His eyes kept darting toward the left, toward something unseen. At a bend in the trail, where the grass grew high enough to brush Elias's knees, he tugged gently on the leash to guide Shadow forward. But Shadow stopped, locked eyes on a thick clump of underbrush to the side. Then, without hesitation, Shadow lunged forward, dragging Elias with sudden force. "Shadow!" Elias hissed, trying not to shout, but when he caught the look in Shadow's eyes, he went quiet. It wasn't fear he saw. It was recognition, a look that said something was here, something important. Elias followed without another word, pushing branches aside as they moved deeper into the overgrowth. Only a few paces in, and then there it was. A rusted steel hatch, half buried in the earth, swallowed by moss, leaves, and time itself. Shadow didn't bark. He simply stepped forward, placed one paw on the lid, and turned to Elias as if to say, "Here. This is it." Elias slowly knelt beside him, brushing away layers of damp dirt. His hand hit cold metal. The moss peeled back, revealing an old, corroded iron handle. From his backpack, Elias pulled out the pry bar he now carried everywhere since the night their house was breached. He wedged the tip beneath the edge of the hatch, drew in a breath, and pushed down with all his strength. Kirk! The sound of metal creaking echoed sharply through the trees. A cloud of dust burst into the air, thick with the stench of rust, mildew, and something long decayed. Together, Elias and Shadow stared down into the opening. They couldn't see where it led, only darkness. A narrow path, sinking deep into the earth. Elias reached over, resting his hand on Shadow's head. "We found it. The door to the past. And this time, no one's getting buried in it again." Shadow didn't move. He didn't need to. He just stood there, silent, waiting for Elias to take the next step. Below them, the bunker waited. And with it, the truth is finally ready to be called by its rightful name. Inside the bunker, the air was heavy and stale, like the weight of years pressing down on every breath. Elias flicked on his flashlight, its dim beam slicing through the darkness, barely enough to reveal the edges of the room. Shadow stayed close, never more than a step behind, his eyes constantly scanning, alert to even the faintest sound. Each footstep echoed along the concrete floor, cold and unwelcoming. The silence clung to them like fog. They turned a corner and found them a pile of old documents, some labeled with red stamps. DARC Confidential. Not government, not military, something hidden, something that had never wanted to be found. Next to the papers were black and white photographs, weathered and torn, but unmistakable. In one of them, Shadow, back when they called him Maximus, was chained with heavy iron links. His muzzle was bloodied, his eyes wide open in agony, begging for help. Elias's breath caught. His knees gave out and he sank to the floor. His hands trembled as he lifted the photo. His lips were dry, his voice brittle. "They tortured you for 3 years. Is that true?" Shadow stepped forward. No growling, no barking. He just rested his head gently on Elias's shoulder, a quiet gesture that said everything. "You're not alone." Elias kept searching. His fingers brushed over a small notebook wedged between files. He flipped it open and froze. Pain threshold testing. Subject K942B. Exhibits high resistance to sedation. Increase shock pulse frequency. A line of words that reads more like a war crime than medical research. His eyes burned. He pulled the metal box closer, the one labeled Silas Only, and held it tight against his chest like a lifeline. Not just evidence now. This was testimony. Shadow wasn't just a victim. Shadow was a living witness to a hidden system of cruelty, cloaked in silence and sealed behind doors no one dared open. He didn't need to wonder anymore. He knew exactly what needed to happen next. This couldn't stay buried. This couldn't be forgotten. He clenched the box in both hands, as if it held the weight of everything that had ever been silenced. Elias looked at Shadow, who stood quietly at his side, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself feel the strength of that presence. Shadow didn't say a word, but his head lowered onto Elias's knee, soft and steady, a quiet offering of strength, a silent promise. And in that moment, Elias made one too. No more hiding, no more secrets. No matter the cost, this truth, Shadow's truth, was going to be seen. Elias grabbed his phone without hesitation and called Reddick, the one man he trusted to do this the right way. Not with rage, but with justice. His voice was hoarse, trembling slightly, but steady in its resolve. "I have everything," he said. "The documents, the photos, the hard drive. I need your help to bring this out. The right time, the right way." On the other end, Reddick was silent for a few moments. Then his voice came through, calm and low. "Send me your location. I'll be there." Elias looked down at Shadow. His eyes were tired, but they held something steady now, something deeply anchored. "They erased your name like you were just some number, but memories can't be deleted. And now I'll make sure the world knows your real name." He carefully packed the files, photos, and hard drive into his backpack, zipping it shut with quiet finality. With one last glance around the bunker, Elias and Shadow stepped out into the morning air. The heavy steel door slammed behind them, sealing away the shadows of what had been. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Sunlight broke through the treetops and poured across their path as they walked side by side, step by steady step, toward what came next. Elias leaned toward Shadow, his voice barely more than a whisper, as if speaking to the part of himself that had stayed silent for too long. Silence helped them bury the truth, but now the truth has teeth. Morning sun streamed between the city buildings as Elias and Shadow made their way into the heart of Tucson, Arizona. The desert heat was sharp, dry, and unforgiving, so different from the cool forests they once called home. But inside Elias, something hotter burned. A fire that had never gone out. He looked down at Shadow again, his tone firm but soft. Silence helped them hide everything before. But not anymore. The truth bites now. They stopped outside a nondescript building, modest, quiet, almost forgettable. But this was it. The place where Silas Creed, whose real name was Jason Rohr, now worked under a new identity, disguised as a small-time security consultant. This was the thread they had chased across years, the man behind it all. Their final lead. In a small, windowless FBI outpost, the glow of a computer screen lit Elias's face as he scanned the latest file Reddick had sent. Page after page revealed the trail of Jason Rohr's double life, from daily routines to financial ties to the shell companies that masked deeper secrets. Elias read each line slowly, eyes narrowing with every discovery. Every timestamp, every address, every unfamiliar name could be a missing piece. He traced the patterns with his fingertip, connecting dots that led back not just to Shadow's past, but to something bigger, something built to stay hidden. But not anymore. Before they stepped into the final chapter, Elias took a moment to prepare with care. He checked Shadow's leash and adjusted the collar that still bore the old serial number. It fit snugly around Shadow's neck, like a memory that refused to fade. Elias looked deep into Shadow's eyes. Those eyes were calm, unwavering, and free of fear even after all they'd endured. Memories surfaced like flickering reels from a long-forgotten film, grueling training drills at the base, long nights on hostile ground, the countless times Shadow had hurled himself into danger just to shield Elias from death itself. Those eyes had seen war, betrayal, and survival. And now they spoke a silent promise. Whatever was coming, it would not be like before. Despite the tension pulling tight in his chest, Elias felt a fire building inside. This confrontation with Silas wouldn't be easy. The man was cunning and dangerous and hid truths that could reshape both their lives forever. Their vehicle rolled quietly out of the FBI station, gliding through Tucson's empty streets. Shadow lay still on the back seat, but his ears remained perked, tuned in to every murmur, every creak of the quiet neighborhoods they passed. His instincts were fully awake. Ready. Elias glanced back, a warmth blooming in his chest. He whispered softly, "We're going to get justice, Shadow. You're not alone anymore." Sunlight filtered through the windshield, laying golden streaks across the dusty road. The buildings outside looked worn and quiet, as if holding their breath. But in Elias's mind, everything was clear now. The road ahead might be treacherous, but it was paved with purpose. And this time, it would lead them to truth and to justice. The hum of engines broke the night silence. Patrol lights danced across dark walls, sweeping slowly around the small house where Silas Creed was hiding. Everything held still, like the world itself had paused for the showdown it knew was coming. Elias stood outside, Shadow beside him, never straying. Shadow's body was tense but still. His ears were upright, his eyes locked on the wooden door ahead. There was no fear in his posture, no hesitation. Only alertness, only readiness, like he could feel every heartbeat behind that door. Then, the door creaked open, slowly, and Silas Creed stepped out. His frame was still, his expression was composed, but his eyes, sharp as broken glass, betrayed the tension beneath. And Shadow? Shadow didn't bark. Shadow didn't lunge. He growled, low, resonant, and final. That growl wasn't noise. It was a declaration, a line drawn in blood and bone. "You're not escaping this time." The FBI team stood frozen, taken aback by the sheer weight of Shadow's presence. He needed no command, no words. His body, his glare, carried a message louder than any shout. He was no longer just a K-9. He was the voice for every name erased, every pain endured, every truth silenced. And now, the reckoning had arrived. Silas knew the moment had come. His eyes darted from Shadow to Elias, scanning for a way out, a weakness, anything. But there was no escaping what was unfolding. No fast-talking his way through. No more hiding behind shadows. This wasn't just about the law catching up, it was something deeper. Something that had teeth. Elias leaned in close to Shadow, his voice low and steady as stone. "He remembers everything now, Shadow. He's not falling for it again." The silence between them was thick, humming with tension. Shadow's eyes stayed locked on Silas, not blinking, not backing down. In that unbroken stare was a storm of judgment, like Shadow himself was weighing the man's soul. Then, with sharp precision, the trap was sprung. Elias gave the nod. The FBI team moved in sync, swift and unrelenting. In a blur of movement, Silas was restrained. Cold steel snapped around his wrists. The weight of justice came down with a final click. Shadow didn't move. He didn't need to. His job wasn't done until Silas was out of sight. Those eyes followed every step, burning holes through the back of the man who had tried to erase him from history. Elias let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He placed his hand gently on Shadow's head, the familiar warmth seeping into his palm. For the first time in years, he felt something like peace. The mission wasn't over. They had miles to go, truths to unearth, and voices to give back. But tonight, they'd taken down a giant. Outside, Tucson slept beneath a veil of desert darkness. Patrol lights flickered across broken sidewalks and cracked windows. Inside that quiet, old house, something ancient had shifted. A secret, rotting for years, had finally been pulled into the light. Silas Creed stood frozen in the white glare of FBI flashlights, his breath sharp and uneven. He tried to hold his composure, but the way his fingers twitched gave him away. The truth had caught him, and this time, it had 4 legs. The agents closed in. Rights were read. A name was spoken, one that Silas had used to hide, but there was no hiding anymore. The cuffs closed around his wrists like a period at the end of a long, brutal sentence. Shadow stood firm beside Elias, his body blocking the exit like a fortress of fur and fury. No barking, no growling, just a stare so sharp it could carve regret into stone. In that moment, Shadow didn't need to speak. His silence roared. There was no forgiveness here, only reckoning, and the message was clear. Betrayal ends now. Elias let out a soft breath, his hand gliding gently through Shadow's thick fur as if trying to pass along his strength, his gratitude. He looked deep into those unwavering eyes and found something that hadn't changed, not through fire, pain, or betrayal. Shadow's quiet resilience. Yes, Silas had been captured. The mastermind. The man behind the chain of suffering that had broken so many lives, including Shadow's. But Elias knew this wasn't the end. The road to justice was still long. Behind Silas, there were other shadows hiding in silence, pulling strings and playing gods. Still, today, something sacred had been restored. Shadow was no longer a discarded tool, no longer a name erased from the record. Today, he was seen for who he truly was, a soldier, a friend, a living testament to the truth. Around them, officers swept the scene, collecting weapons, documents, and the traces left behind by a machine built for secrecy and violence. The signs were all there: tactical blades, signal jammers, and nameless dog tags. This wasn't random. This was organized, brutal, and designed to stay buried. Elias stood quietly, his eyes never leaving Shadow. For the first time in so long, he felt something like peace. Shadow stood still, too, unshaken, as if shielding Elias not just from danger, but from despair. The door to that house finally closed behind them, but in Elias's heart, another door had just begun to open. The door to truth, to reckoning, to justice. He knew this was only the beginning. He and Shadow had work left to do. Silas was only the first stone lifted. Beneath him lay a web of corruption waiting to be pulled into the light. The final image was simple but unforgettable. Elias and Shadow stood side by side, the darkness of the street curling around their silhouettes, but their eyes looked forward, toward the long road ahead, toward the light waiting at the end of it. Elias whispered, his voice soft but full of conviction. "You're not alone anymore. And now the truth has teeth. We're not leaving anyone behind." At dawn, the Pentagon's grand atrium was packed wall to wall. Golden light poured over polished floors, casting a warm glow on the flags and gleaming medals overhead. Military officials, former teammates, the press, and family members filled the space, their eyes shining with emotion and anticipation. Footsteps echoed as the ceremony began. A host stepped onto the stage, his voice deep, clear, carrying through the stillness of the room. Today we gather to honor a very special soldier, Shadow German Shepherd, designation K942B, a loyal partner, a silent hero, a warrior who braved the unthinkable, who saved lives not with words, but with heart. The moment the name Shadow was spoken, the room erupted. Applause thundered across the chamber like a wave. Eyes turned to where Elias stood with Shadow at his side. Shadow didn't flinch. Ears perked. Gaze focused. That calm, determined expression never changed. Because he didn't need the medals, the speeches, or the applause. Shadow already knew who he was. A fighter. A protector. And now, finally, a name the world would never forget. When it came time to receive the honor, Shadow didn't step onto the stage. Instead, Shadow gently rested his head against Elias's leg, as if to say, "The greatest reward is being here with you, the one who walked through every dark day with me." Elias knelt down, his hand tenderly stroking Shadow's head, his eyes full of quiet love and pride. That simple image man and a dog, side by side, no words, no grand gestures, silenced the entire room. You could feel it. The weight of a bond too deep for language. A friendship built not on commands, but on shared pain, loyalty, and unshakable trust. As the final echoes of applause faded into the distance, the image of Elias and Shadow remained etched deeply into the hearts of everyone who had witnessed their story. It wasn't just a moment. It became a lasting symbol. A symbol of unbreakable friendship, unwavering loyalty, and the quiet, relentless strength of life itself. It reminded everyone of something simple, yet so easy to forget. That no matter how hard life gets, no matter how impossible the road ahead may seem, with love and trust by your side, anything is possible. After countless days of pain and struggle, Elias and Shadow finally found a place to rest. A small wooden cabin nestled deep in the forest, far away from sirens, gunfire, and the chaos of the world. Out here, the air was clean. Birds sang in the treetops. The wind whispered softly through the leaves. Every morning, Elias woke with a breath that filled him from the inside out, full of peace he once thought he'd never feel again. Shadow would dart across the yard, playful as a pup, no longer carrying the weight of battles past. No longer on edge, just living. At night, the fireplace crackled gently. Its warm glow danced across the walls while Shadow curled up beside Elias, resting his head against the floor with a calm that only comes when the war inside finally quiets down. Elias would sit by the window, eyes lifted to the stars, grateful to simply be, grateful to still have the one soul who never let go. Their story, a man and his dog, spread far beyond that cabin in the woods. It touched people, not just because of what they endured, but because of what they chose. They chose love, even when the world gave them pain. They chose trust, even when betrayal felt easier. They chose each other. And that choice became a light for others. The applause from that Pentagon ceremony would eventually fade. But what it stood for wouldn't. It would live on in the quiet strength of those who keep going, in the soft footfalls of a dog that once saved a man's soul, in the knowledge that real strength doesn't come from weapons or medals, but from a heart that refuses to stop loving. Because some warriors don't wear uniforms, some don't carry rifles, some walk on 4 legs, with scars no one sees and eyes that have witnessed too much. But still they protect. Still they love. Shadow was one of them. Sometimes the soul feels so broken it seems beyond repair, like nothing could ever bring it back. But then something happens. A hand reaching out, an honest look, a presence that says, "You're not alone." That's what Elias and Shadow gave each other. They brought life back to what felt lost forever. Together, they did something extraordinary. The love Shadow had for Elias never wavered. It never dimmed. It never asked for anything in return. It was the kind of love that stands guard in silence, that shows up in the darkest moments, that never once considers leaving. Shadow wasn't just a dog. Shadow was a companion, a protector, a piece of Elias's very soul. And it was that love, quiet and steadfast, that carried them through. It's what still carries them now. Into the woods, into the unknown, into whatever comes next. Together, always. The story of Elias and Shadow is not just about a man and his dog. It is a powerful lesson in perseverance, loyalty, and the strength of true love. No matter how hard life gets, if you have someone who walks beside you with honesty and trust, you can overcome anything. That's the message their journey leaves for all of us. That love, resilience, and loyalty are invisible warriors. You can't hold them in your hands, but they're stronger than any weapon in the world.